Hello and welcome to this week's edition of World Today, where we will be talking about the big leadership summit level meetings in Rome and in Glasgow, Scotland. The focus remained climate change and how to fight it, how to tackle it. But there was no consensus when it comes to how the world leaders are going to shape the future of the world, the planet, the environment. Tall promises were made, but we'll have to wait and see whether they're going to keep the promises or not. In this edition, we'll be focusing and diving deep into the COP26 climate summit, as also promises made with regards to the security situation by the G20 leaders. Madagascar is on the brink of famine, and the Amazon river city of Manaus is flooding due to change in rain patterns over the vast rainforest. The shrinking of giant ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, and the melting of glaciers. The situation, already alarming, is set to worsen by the end of the year, with people living in famine-like conditions expected to double.
Madagascar is on the brink of famine, suffering from a drought caused by climate change in a country which has nearly zero carbon emissions. Madagascar is one of the poorest countries on the planet. The pain of a more extreme climate can be seen firsthand here, as reports of babies dying and mothers unable to assist them due to their own hunger are rampant. Experiencing one of the longest droughts the country has seen in 40 years, many people have taken to digging through dry riverbeds to try and reach the water table buried below. The severe drought and dust storms that currently grip the country make farming close to impossible. The country relies heavily on its tourism industry for income, but that was ravaged when the coronavirus pandemic took hold. Madagascar is yet to open its doors for foreign visitors to return.
To me, Madagascar is a wake-up call to the rest of the world of what is to be expected in the future from other nations. When you go in the Sahel now, you're facing these issues now. Look at Angola. Angola's now facing very similar issues.
There's drought, and then there are floods. The Amazon river city of Manaus is often on the front lines of climate change. Buffeted by alternating waves of drought and flooding due to changes in rain patterns over the vast rainforest. In Humaita, a city 700 kilometers north of Manaus, where several important forest reserves are located nearby, farmers and ranchers have been steadily encroaching on protected land, seeking to expand their holdings.
There is a lot to talk about slash and burn, that there is more of it in our state, and that is causing a lot of damage.
The pattern is repeated throughout the Brazilian Amazon, despite government pledges of crackdowns and intervention, presenting a challenge for the Bolsonaro government of Brazil. Africa and South America could be the poor cousins of North America, but the impact of climate change knows no segregation of economic development. The United States has had 265 weather disasters that caused at least $1 billion in damage each since 1992. These include 18 such disasters of this year alone. Those disasters have caused 11,991 deaths and cost $1.8 trillion. From 1980 to 1992, the US averaged 3 of those billion-dollar weather disasters a year. Since 1993, the country has averaged 9 a year.
We view this as a humanitarian crisis because these storms are devastating, they're more chronic, they're going to require more from us as an organization.
Over the last 3 decades, Earth has lost 36 trillion tons of ice. That includes sea ice in the Arctic and Antarctic that now melts more in the summer than it used to, the shrinking of giant ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, and melting glaciers.
The land, ocean, and atmosphere are coupled, and if you disrupt any one of them, it has a cascading effect on all the entire planetary system.
more ice melt in the ocean and water expanding as it warms, the world's average sea level has risen about 3.7 inches since 1992, according to the University of Colorado.
Anything you do in the name of climate change.
Protesters took to the streets of Glasgow in Scotland to denounce what they say is greenwashing by companies as the climate conference continued in the country.
What do we do here if we are still incentivizing that there?
Governments and big investors announced fresh plans to pour trillions of dollars into curbing global warming, reflecting the financial world's growing embrace of efforts to fight climate change as both a business necessity and opportunity. But some social justice activists called for scrutiny of investors' motives. They warn that the same financial institutions which profited from funding fossil fuel firms were now being presented as green champions.
We've had enough forests burning. We've had enough trees being ripped down to put up somebody's projects. And the reality is, it's crazy. The trees will help to let you live.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
A meeting to remember or one to forget. COP26 climate summit held in Glasgow, Scotland, showed a lot of promise but no firm commitment, which begs the question, will the leaders or the countries walk the talk in this fight against climate change? The targets for net zero emissions were also set way beyond the 2030 target that most climate activists have been demanding, and again way beyond any of the leaders, political or career spans who actually attended this conference.
It in the ground, just keep it in the ground. Keep it in the ground, just keep it in the ground.
World leaders descended in Glasgow for the COP26 climate summit in their private jets. And that is how began the fight against climate change that kicked off in Scotland. With many painting a doomsday picture amid glorious speeches and ambitious goals, host nation UK urged the world to get real.
Few weeks. Humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now. If we don't get serious about climate change today, it will be too late for our children to do so tomorrow.
The COP26, which is critical to averting the most disastrous effects of climate change, kicked off on Monday. Its task made even more daunting by the failure of major industrial nations to agree to ambitious new commitments.
Would it not be marvellous to suppose that as a consequence of our discoveries and that science's discoveries, that the nations of the world joined together and actually did something at COP in this coming conference? Let us see what it does. But I hope and pray that, my goodness, it takes action, that the nations of the world, in the light of the scientific discoveries that this ship will undoubtedly be making, that nations got together and listened to the science.
Serious conversations did take place around achieving net zero targets and some game-changing pledges on methane emissions and deforestation. More than 100 countries pledged on Tuesday to end deforestation in the coming decade, a promise that experts say would be critical to limiting climate change, but one that has been made and broken before. More than $19 billion American dollars in public and private funds have been pledged towards the plan. Forests are important ecosystems and provide a critical way of absorbing carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. Trees are one of the world's major so-called carbon sinks, or places where carbon is stored. About 130 world leaders attended Glasgow COP26 meet, with a focus on keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. The forum concentrated on the stark disparity and expectation from developing nations, while the developed world failed to commit to take responsibility of bigger historical polluters than the lesser developed nations.
Developed countries must lead the effort. But emerging economies too must go the extra mile, as their contribution is essential for the effective reduction of emissions. We need maximum ambition from all countries on all fronts to make Glasgow a success. I urge developed countries and the emerging economies to build coalitions to create the financial and technological conditions to accelerate the decarbonization of the economy as well as the phase-out of coal.
World leaders were given stark warnings at the COP26 climate conference. But in terms of achieving net zero emissions, the world is divided, with some pledging to achieve the target in 2030, some others in 2050, 2060 and 2070. The world and its leadership would have completely changed by then, and we will see if targets would be achieved by then, or are these empty promises leading to hollow futures of the next generation.
There can be no solution to climate change unless and until big powers and, more importantly, bigger emitters join the fight against climate change and this global menace. At COP26 Glasgow meet, two world leaders were conspicuous by their absence: Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. While Russia and China did partake in conversations on the sidelines, they were not physically present for the COP26 summit.
More than 120 leaders turned up at the conference in Scotland's largest city. But China and Russia did not make it. Despite the fact that China is the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, followed by the US. Russia is the fifth largest after the EU and India.
I indicated that China and Russia not showing up in Saudi Arabia was a problem. We showed up. We showed up. And by showing up, we've had a profound impact on the way I think the rest of the world is looking at the United States and its leadership role. I think it's been a big mistake, quite frankly, for China, with respect to China not showing up.
Russia and China are among the top 5 emitters in the current context. With a no-show, any forward movement to tackle climate change would be redundant. While China's President Xi Jinping has not left China since the pandemic spread globally in early 2020, Russian side was vague on why Putin was missing in action.
The president has already recorded a video message to participants of this conference. Glasgow's topics echoed climate topics at G20 in many respects. Russia has clearly set its perspectives. Besides that, Russia is ahead of many countries, including Western European countries, on many parameters in terms of transition to less carbon-intensive ways of generation and production.
Many believe that Xi Jinping has not left the country because he is trying to quell a domestic political resistance against him. But that has not stopped Beijing from responding to the West's jibe for his absence and reminding them of who walked out of the Paris Agreement.
China and US once jointly accomplished the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. But because the US walked away, the full and effective implementation of global governance and agreement has been undermined. As for the US return this year, China has joined the international community to welcome it with a constructive attitude. We hope the US will earnestly shoulder due responsibility.
China has been speaking of climate justice along with many other developing nations. That the developed nations will have to shoulder the burden for having polluted the planet long before the others. Both China and Russia are signatories of the pledge to reverse deforestation. In September, Xi Jinping announced China will aim for carbon neutrality by 2060, with a plan to hit peak emissions before 2030. President Putin said Russia would also strive to reach carbon neutrality no later than 2060 in an International Energy Forum speech on 13th October.
Key thing that China is saying is that they want to get to a peak in their carbon emissions by 2030 or before. And when you listen to what Xi Jinping says, the question is how much before? Because, and that's the issue, and that's what we're discussing with China, because there is still, there's a world difference between peaking in 2030 in your emissions from China and peaking in 2025. And so that's where the conversation is. That's where we're keeping the pressure up.
While achieving net zero or becoming carbon neutral is a tall ask. It certainly will remain unfulfilled if Russia and China are not on board, and if the East-West fissures continue to damage the process to reverse climate change and global warming.
Now, the climate crisis, vaccine equity, an energy crunch, and global supply chain snarls were in the spotlight when world leaders from top 20 countries met at the G20 summit held in Italy's capital city of Rome. The leaders met to discuss various issues, but when it comes to consensus on pressing issues, it was rather unfulfilled. Here's a report.
They tossed for a better future. But then the reality struck. National interest trumped global interest, and pressing issues were left without any firm commitment. The first in-person gathering of a group of 20 leaders since 2019 took place as the global economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic faces a slew of challenges. From new strains of COVID-19 to supply shortage and inflation, to the fissures in forming a consensus on climate change, and the differences in handling the ongoing development in Afghanistan and Iran.
So, what's the success of this summit? Well, G20 countries committed to keeping the 1.5 target within reach, with a series of immediate actions and medium-term commitments.
There were some forward movement on honoring earlier pledges when it came to the issue of climate change. According to the final summit communique, the G20 reaffirmed past commitments to mobilize $100 billion annually to help poorer countries cope with the climate change, and committed to scaling up financing for helping them adapt. A United Nations report estimated that it would be several more years before rich nations made good on the commitment.
The governments of the 20 most important countries in the world are constantly failing on climate and environment because emissions are constantly increasing. This is worrisome because they don't even tell us the truth.
While leaders committed to limit global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, the G20 communique contained few concrete actions and made no reference to a specific 2050 date to achieve net zero carbon emission. The United States of America added that there was no need for punitive action against fossil fuel usage in order to meet the target of reaching zero carbon emissions by 2050.
That we have tax credits of $320 billion for dealing with alternatives by people getting tax credit for moving on solar panels, on wind, and a whole range of other things, and winterizing their properties. I don't think you're going to need any punitive action to get people to step up and do those things.
The leaders discussed vaccine equity and the need for access to vaccines in countries across the world. That such inequity exists in itself is immoral and unjustified. The summit on the first of its 2 days heard pleas to boost the percentage of those in poor countries being vaccinated. Rich countries have been accused of hoarding the vaccines. They used vaccines and stimulus spending to restart economic activity. leaving the risk that developing countries that account for much of global growth will remain behind due to low vaccinations and financing difficulties.
As part of our work, today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced Canada's increased commitment to international vaccine sharing through COVAX, through which Canada will donate 200 million doses and $15 million to help develop vaccine production in South Africa.
China and Russia, among some other leaders, did not physically attend the meeting, but exercised their opinion through virtual format.
As an ancient Chinese philosopher observed, he who has the credibility connects the world. In other words, credibility is the foundation for interactions with the world. China will stay committed to the fundamental state policy of opening up to unleash the potential of its huge market and enormous domestic demand.
Fissures were clearly visible. Credibility of the forum is now in question when nations cannot speak in one voice on crucial matters. Even on Afghanistan and Iran, opinions differed.
We are, of course, counting on Iran to return to the negotiating table. However, time is passing and enrichment is continuing in Iran. That worries us a lot. And that's why it was time to talk about what can be done to prevent Iran from being armed with nuclear weapons.
The G20 was created in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s to give emerging economies a more prominent voice in global financial affairs. The annual Leaders Summit became a regular feature in 2008 in response to the global financial crisis. With a membership roster that accounts for more than 80% of world gross domestic product, 75% of global trade and 60% of the world's population, the club is uniquely positioned to set priorities and marshal the resources to tackle them.
Not only for their sake.
And here is World at a Glance with some other stories from across the world.
Britain on Thursday granted conditional authorization for Merck's coronavirus antiviral, the first pill shown to successfully treat COVID-19. It is the first country to approve the treatment, although it was not immediately clear how quickly the pill would be available. The drug is known as Molnupiravir. Merck announced preliminary results last month showing its drug cut hospitalizations and deaths by half among patients with early COVID-19 symptoms. The results haven't yet been peer-reviewed or published in a scientific journal. As Ethiopia marks one-year war against Tigrayan forces and their allies, the United States and other countries are calling for an immediate ceasefire and accountability for those accused of human rights abuses. The war that has killed thousands of people and displaced millions since November 2020 threatens to engulf Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Thousands of Ethiopians filled the stadium in the capital to show their support for new military recruits. The event came as Ethiopia's government lashed out in response to international alarm about hate speech, comparing rival Tigray forces to a rat that strays far from its hole and saying the country is close to burying the evil forces. Hollywood actor Alec Baldwin was involved in a fatal gunfire accident on the sets of his latest movie, which led to the killing of Halyana Hutchins, 42, the film's director of photography. Alec Baldwin was filming a sitting scene and was having a gun with a live round that struck and killed the film's cinematographer and wounded its director and raised new questions about firearm safety on film sets. While investigations are underway, actor Dwayne Johnson has pledged to never again use real guns in his films.
That's all in this edition of World Today, but before I go, climate change has been the topic of the week and will continue to remain so at the COP26 meet in Glasgow, which is underway, brainstorming sessions on how to move forward And even as that is happening, here are visuals of how protesters are asking questions to the world leaders whether they are actually going to walk the talk or not. Activists posed as world leaders playing in a traditional Scottish pipe band as world leaders came together at the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow. Armed with bagpipes and dressed in kilts, the campaigners' strong message to world leaders that they need to come up with more action and not only hot air to tackle the climate crisis. Goodbye and take care.